There's that old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that is so true here. I don't care how good your strategy is. If your culture's poor, you're probably not going to execute on your company goals. And data is a transparency agent that helps bring culture together.
We spend a lot of time on this show talking about how important data is in making sure we're up to date on the latest compliance procedures. And it's important to stay ahead of the latest technologies, not least because criminals are as well. But it's also important to remember the role that culture plays in ensuring that compliance teams stay current. That's why today we're speaking to someone who understands both sides of the equation. Vincent Walden is the CEO of konaAI, an AI-driven compliance software company focused on creating compliance solutions for the modern world. He first caught my eye earlier this year with his article in Fraud magazine called Who Owns Transaction and Controls Monitoring. In the article, Vincent advocates for a collective strategy of accountability across multiple departments, one that is informed by data, but not solely defined by it. In this episode, we discuss the challenges of interdepartmental collaboration, the constantly evolving compliance landscape, and Vincent's experiences in uncovering fraud through effective risk management practices. This is BCG on Compliance, a podcast that explores today's most pressing financial crime trends and how compliance professionals are adapting to stay ahead of that curve. I'm Hanjo Siebert. I started our conversation by checking in with Vincent on what inspired him to write the article.
Running a business-to-business software company focused on compliance and fraud risk management, it's my passion to develop leading innovations around fraud risk management controls and algorithms. And I saw so many times when I talked to either our customers or some of our prospective customers, I would hear, who does the transaction monitoring? Who's actually looking at it? And if you think about it from a compliance perspective, so much work and money and effort is spent on due diligence. But when you think about it, where does the fraud actually happen? Does the fraud happen during due diligence or when you actually exchange money with the third party or do business with the third party? And of course, and it's funny, I say this to attorneys all the time and like, gosh, I've never really thought about it like that. But to everybody, due diligence is just doing background checks and doing the upfront. But really, the risk is in the actual doing business. Now, again, not to say that due diligence isn't important, you need it, but my gosh, you got to monitor the transactions. And I think that, the US DOJ has made that clear in their latest evaluation of corporate compliance programs. COSO makes it clear in their fraud risk management guide. So that who owns transaction monitoring, when I ask that to compliance professionals, oftentimes they say, oh, well, that's finance's job or that's someone else's job. And when I think about, from an accounting perspective, yes, it's finance's job to make sure the accounts payable gets paid. And maybe there's some controls around, making sure that you're within policy. But from a anti-corruption perspective, anti-fraud perspective, oftentimes procurement or payments, accounts payable people, they're not trained as fraud examiners or investigators, and they don't have that mindset. So it's really oftentimes, up to the company to have some oversight, especially large global companies with complex risks, to oversee the transactions. And that's really what inspired me to write the article and to say, look, compliance professionals, your role is around the life cycle of the client or the vendor or third party relationship, not just at the beginning. So Hanjo, I know that's a long answer, but really it's a big passion of mine that I like to get out to our audience base.
Yeah, I love it. I also like the distinction, right? Because if you talk about transaction monitoring and your article splits it into who owns the transaction and who controls monitoring, I think that's a very interesting discussion to be had just on the title, right? Because business potentially sees, we're quote unquote owning the transaction because it's close to the client, but why do we need to monitor it, right? Where doesn't the two things come together or how do you then segregate the duties and why do you do it also most effectively, right? Regardless from who does it, but where in the cycle, as you were saying, where do you do the monitoring of the risks most effectively?
That's right. And also think about, monitoring for what?
Yeah.
Depends on the role of the person. Monitoring for sanctions and trade compliance, well, that's a compliance and legal topic that the accounts payable person may or may not be familiar with. Now, there's likely controls in place that person needs to adhere to, but are those controls actually being met, and are they within the controls? And that's someone in an oversight role needs to be looking. But yeah, it's interesting to think your role biases, depending on whether you went to law school or you went to accounting school or business school, in terms of what you think is risk and who owns fraud. And because if you're an attorney, typically you'll think about, you're more comfortable with words. You'll think about the due diligence and the background checks, right? But if you're an accounting person or finance professional, you're going to jump to the numbers and you're going to look at the transactions, but you might look at it from an accounting perspective, not a legal perspective. And the answer is, as we all know and think about, a good fraud risk management program considers all aspects of it. And a good compliance program looks at both legal risks as well as internal control risks and makes sure that the company's adhering to both.
So Vince, is that actually one of the reasons why fraud risk management is often so unclear in organizations? And what are other reasons and obstacles that prevent more clarity and transparency in fraud risk management?
Yeah, the classic question of who owns fraud within the organization is very much an unanswered and undefined question. Now, COSO and most accountants, and actually, no, I think generally everybody believes it's a committee approach. It's a governance approach. And people need to get to the table and bring multiple disciplines to fight fraud risk. I mean, I would hate to be the single person within a mid to large organization and saying, I'm responsible for all fraud within the organization. That just doesn't happen. You couldn't pay me enough to have that job. But now, oftentimes, the chief compliance officer, or maybe it's the head of internal investigations or legal, or sometimes even internal audit, might be the chair of the committee. But fraud risk management is best addressed when it's a committee approach. And if you don't do it that way, you get multiple silos and fiefdoms of fraud risk initiatives. And I've seen it happen so much and so often where resources can be wasted, where finance will have their fraud risk management department and have their initiatives and communications. Compliance will have their fraud risk or fraud awareness campaigns and initiatives. And maybe internal audit might do something too. And there's a lot of duplication and overlap. And the employees are saying, well, who is it? Who do I follow? And again, most, I would say Fortune 500 companies now have matured enough and they understand that it is a committee approach and coordination needs to happen between human resources, obviously compliance and legal, finance and the CFO, and very importantly, IT and information technology, whether it's cybersecurity, as well as getting access to the relevant data that you need to provide oversight. IT is often the custodians of that, and perhaps even sales or the business. So it is a committee approach as best practices. The COSO Fraud Risk Management Guide says that. The DOJ's Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Program evaluates, how represented is the compliance professional as part of the tone of the top involved in the committee. So really, it's to reduce that risk. It's not one person's job. And I think that's why it gets convoluted and mixed up sometimes.
Collaborating across multiple departments in a compliance setting can be difficult. But Vincent gives a clear-eyed perspective on the obstacles that can hinder effective fraud risk management.
There's all sorts of challenges that go against working in a collaborative environment, but it's so necessary because, I don't have to answer why. You'll miss things if you're in your silo. When we talk about data silos, you'll miss certain connections or relationships if you're only looking at your data for your job and role in a silo. And the reason that collaboration can be difficult is because of all the data privacy and challenges and risks around data. Again, this is a balance, right? You can't open up everything to everybody and say, here's full transparency, because then you have data privacy risks. So usually that's pretty open. And even the auditor as well, that should be a free-flowing communication of both people talking and sharing of data. and you need to be mindful of cross-border and data sharing around PII, particularly around employees. But, accounting data and vendor data or sales data and customer data, those are some of the things that need to be in collaboration with through tools and technology. One of the things that I do at konaAI is we bring in multiple stakeholders to one data set. So, for example, I can take the entire ERP system of a global organization or several ERPs, put it into one data warehouse, run algorithms of risk tests around multiple stakeholders, and provide an environment where procurement can see their risks, the compliance and maybe sanctions and trade people can see their risks and have their tests, and internal audit can have their tests in 3 separate environments, but able to leverage the same data source and communicate on that. Many of the tests are shared, some aren't, some might even be privileged, but breaking down those data silos is really what's key and helps bring more transparency to the business.
And do you think there's a new trend, especially in fraud, that collaboration happens more? And I don't know if I'm right here, right? But I'm just putting out a hypothesis here. Collaboration is a lot around also the data level and the modeling level, whereas maybe historically it's been a bit more about how do I make sure that all the people that are sitting in different departments have to speak to one another without me being able to oversee this and surveil this on a daily basis. But now with data, it's almost more by governance, forcing quote unquote people for collaboration. Is that a new paradigm that you would see?
I would agree with that paradigm. Yeah. When we say collaboration, now certainly it starts with people interacting. I always advocate, look, internal auditors, go take your compliance team to lunch or vice versa. And even better yet, compliance people, take your IT, your information technology people to lunch. Get to know them, because when there's an investigation or when there's when you're wanting to do some kind of proactive monitoring, you're going to need data from them. There's an old saying, I don't know who said it, I forgot, but data is the ultimate equalizer. And when you come with facts and you come with real data, you have a seat at the table. And yes, you have to meet in person, but really, I've seen a lot of great companies now over the last 5 years, especially, put together the data lakes, put together the shared centralized abilities to multiple users accessing the same data set in one warehouse. And that really breaks down data silos and creates custom reports for whatever use case one person might need. I mean, it's tough when there's 30 different ERP systems all around the world, and everybody can get access to their own, but no one can see the whole picture.
Vincent has a clear vision for improving fraud risk management, but I was curious about how his company, konaAI, fits into the concepts he discussed. What types of clients and industries does he work with? And more importantly, what does that reveal about the rapidly changing world of compliance?
Many of our buyers of the konaAI platform are either in compliance, internal audit, or within finance, particularly around vendor risk management and third parties, because our software analyzes everything around vendors, procure to pay, customers, order to cash, and employees, particularly their travel and entertainment expenses or their payroll. But within that domain, let me give you some great use. We're seeing a lot of great use cases in minerals and mining. And if you think about it, the ACFEs report to the nations, the number one highest industry, the biggest fraud risk per incident, it was like $500,000 per incident, was sadly in the minerals and mining space. So we have a lot of mineral and mining companies, in fact, some of the largest in the world, using the platform to look at their spend data and their employees' T&E data, but particularly their procure to pay spend data, to look for corruption risks, sanctions, trade compliance risks, conflicts of interest, et cetera. And as I could quote, like one of the chief compliance officers says, it gives me a sense when I can look at the data, billions of dollars in aggregate in a dashboard and in a risk scoring kind of framework of here's my highest risk transactions and my highest risk vendors based on the transactional activity. It's giving me a sense of comfort that I know I have things in control. If I see things going rogue in a certain country or high risk transaction in a certain country, more so from one period to the next, I know I can go look at that. And it gives them that transparency. Aerospace and defense, obviously, is a big one. Anything that's highly regulated. Telecommunications, several companies in telecom, and we have some of the largest retailers also in the world using the platform because, again, they've got sales and vendor spend and transportation, shipping of goods all over the world, and they need a central place to be able to look for potentially improper payments. I always say the more data sources that you can integrate, the better risk questions that you can ask. It starts with the transactions, but gosh, when you can pull in due diligence data and historical investigations data, you can really design some great fraud risk tests to find hidden money.
How do you stay ahead, or what do you do to stay ahead in this rapidly moving world, and especially stay ahead in so many different countries and markets?
Well, at our software company to date, we've had the privilege. We've been fortunate enough. We've processed a lot of our clients' data, particularly around spend and payments data, but even some customer data. And we just crossed the $1 trillion of data processed. So you think about $1 trillion. Interestingly, only about 400 million, which is actually less than 0.5%, has been actually tagged for review. That just gives you a sense of the volume, right, and investigated. But what's interesting is, and again, no data is ever combined. We always, all the data is in there. They're either on-prem at the customer site or hosted in our cloud. But we can look at the machine learning models of each individual customer. And when you look at the data across the board, you're able to find patterns and relationships of what's the profile of an improper payment? What are most people clicking on in terms of the risks that they're seeing in the data, which is why they chose to flag it or create a case or investigate it. And that in turn trains our machine learning models. And so interestingly, for example, the number one profile of an improper payment that always seems to be present when something's wrong is when it's urgent. When it was either paid out before it was even invoiced, or paid out and invoiced the same day or within 5 days or something, it's always urgent. And it's typically always statistically anomalous. Oftentimes it has sensitive keywords that are either hitting on our list or comes up in one of our natural language processing algorithms. And oftentimes it's a round dollar, which is indicative of cash, or it's whatever the local currency is, it's in round, so it might be indicative of cash. These are the types of things that allow us to constantly evaluate what that profile of an improper payment is and tune our models for our customers to constantly adapt to changing risks. And that's been a lot of fun.
And without revealing secrets, can you share some concrete stories on what had surprised you from having looked at the data, or where were some preconceived views changed just because you looked at the data and found out, hey, that's actually an anomaly and that's quite surprising to you? What are some of the blockbuster surprises from your work?
When companies don't think, or when executives don't think that there's oversight, just the blatant abuse that I see always tends to shock me. We saw a CFO once of a subsidiary company of one of our customers steal millions of dollars through fake vendor schemes. They would create fake invoices and book it to either labor or work or other types of materials, and usually a service type thing, and extract millions of dollars from the company, which was just heartbreaking. That likely could have been caught with some of the analytics and oversight. So that's one example. We're seeing a lot of interesting things around conflicts of interest. The number one issue in a conflict of interest is when I look at an employee master compared to a vendor master. And it's usually, it's not the person's name, and it's usually not their cell phone or address. Oftentimes, it's funny, their spouse's cell phone is used as the vendor name, and the spouse's phone number just happens to be the emergency contact phone number in the employee's HR records, or they're an employee master and you're able to join. Those were always, I've caught about 5 investigations, or it launched 5 investigations by just doing that. Also, what people, God, there's so many stories, I could bore you with it, but also when you're looking at the changelog things in SAP, which nowadays good companies have that locked down pretty well. But if I'm an administrator and I can change the banking or address information of a payment to my personal account, get that paid out, but then change it back to the normal so that an auditor wouldn't see it, we've seen that happen. But of course, nowadays, many auditors and of course our technology will look at that change log and see what's changed, and that kicks off a lot of secondary reviews. But yeah, the list goes on and on in terms of the schemes that we typically see, but nothing is more satisfying than being able to stop an improper payment before it gets paid. A lot of our customers say, I want this to be in real time. Well, real time only needs to be if your payment terms are 60 days. Well, then you've got 60 days from the invoice coming in to the payment going out to stop that improper payment. And that's usually plenty of time to risk score it and review it. And that's when you can really demonstrate great ROI.
No, absolutely. And I guess in this time, real time means more within the 60 days versus after the money has gone out. But
yeah, good luck getting it when it goes out.
There's so many different interpretations of when people say real time. But no,
right.
I actually think those examples are super fascinating. They are not boring at all. And I think that's also what some of our listeners are really kind of enjoying hearing from us, those concrete stories from practitioners like you. To change gears a little bit, what role does business culture play, in your view, on fraud prevention?
There's that old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that is so true here. I don't care how good your strategy is. If your culture's poor, you're probably not going to execute on your company goals. And data is a transparency agent that helps bring culture together. It helps people say, look, and have data-driven discussions, not just that, hey, I think you should do this because I'm authoritative or whatever, I'm your boss. But hey, I'm seeing these patterns in the data. Here's what I think it means. What do you think it does? What should we do about it? Those are much broader and transparent conversations when the conversations are data-driven. That helps break down data silos. That helps increase and foster a culture of transparency and dialogue that lets people know that management does have their hands on the controls, that management's looking. And back in the FCPA days, especially like the 2015 to 2020s, we heard a lot of compliance fatigue. Everybody was asking, especially in like the pharma industry, everybody was asking for the same data. If you're a sales rep at a pharma back then, you were being asked for data and reports from compliance, from IT, from audit. You were like in the business of compliance, not in the business of selling product or your drugs. That's not what I'm talking about. It's more strategic than that and more integrated. I do believe that, through a data-integrated, data-driven compliance program, you will have better culture because you'll have better communication.
Yeah, and do you have some concrete examples on what you've seen go wrong if there wasn't a good culture or wasn't a good business culture at play?
You could look at any of the big fraud schemes that went down. I did a couple. When I was a consultant, I would do white collar investigations and some of the bigger ones. And I'll never forget, especially like the brokerage houses where it was a boiler room type mentality of sell, make the deal. I mean, we saw money, executives taking from customer deposit accounts, their customer checking account and using it to cover their spread. That was just, flat out stealing. It's like logging into your bank account and taking your money to cover my risk exposure. When the culture's bad, and again, it's set at the tone at the top and filtered down and emulated by management, it can have devastating effects. And again, I go back to the fraud triangle. There was either pressure from management or an individual. There was an opportunity, a lack of controls or lack of oversight, and the person rationalized it in their head that they were doing it for the benefit of themselves, their family, or some altruistic reason. I still think, and again, if you go back to culture, if you're an investigator, you know what I'm talking about. But when I think about, in every case, their fraud triangle is always present. There's always pressure, opportunity, and rationalization.
Is the culture in your organization allowing openness and transparency? Or are you depending solely on data to drive excellence? Join the conversation by connecting with us on your podcast app, writing a review of the show, or emailing us at bcgoncompliance@bcg.com. Be sure to subscribe to get more insights from compliance innovators. I'm Hanjo Siebert. Thanks for listening.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.